Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn After the Lab, Legal Solutions to the Laboratory Animal Rehoming Problem. My name is Jessica Chapman, and I'm a staff attorney with the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I'll be today's moderator. This webinar is part 3 of the After the Lab series and is hosted by the TIPS Animal Law Committee and the ALC's Science and Technology Subcommittee. We'd also like to thank ABA's TIPS section for supporting the webinar series over the past year and a half or so. Feel free to send your questions throughout the presentation, either through the chat function or the Q&A function. We'll answer those questions after the presentations end. And also, you can watch the recordings of part 1 and part 2 of this webinar series, which discuss homing companion animals and primates after their experience in research in laboratories on the ABA TIPS YouTube channel. This webinar will be recorded, is currently being recorded, and it will be uploaded to the channel as well. Our 2 speakers today are Monica Engebretson and Rebecca Critser. Monica is the North American Head of Public Affairs for Cruelty Free International. She's worked in the animal protection movement since 1999 with a range of experience, including undercover investigations, lobbying, and public education campaigns. Her work for Cruelty Free International has focused on initiatives in the US and Canada to end the use of animals in cosmetics and household product testing, advancing humane science and regulatory testing, and government-funded research. Monica resides in California with her family, which includes numerous rescue animals, including Moira and Faye, rabbits who were released from a laboratory. Rebecca is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School for Public Health, where she works as a member of the Toxicology Policy Program to advocate for the advancement of new approach methodologies in order to improve public health and reduce the use of animals in science. She's co-chair of the ABA TIPS Animal Law Committee Science and Technology Subcommittee and teaches as an adjunct professor at IU McKinney's School of Law and Lewis and Clark Law School. Monica will be our first presenter today, and so I will hand it over to you. Thanks.
All right, I'm just gonna share my screen. Now, okay, I think I can advance the slides. Oh, there it is. A quick agenda. I'm going to give a little background on Cruelty Free International, as well as I'm going to go over a few of the key takeaways from the first 2 sessions that we did, the one on primates and the one on companion animals, and then a brief overview of state laws and federal laws and some recommendations before handing it over to Rebecca. Oops, I skipped a slide. So Cruelty Free International, we were established in 1898, originally known as the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. In 2013, we changed our name to Cruelty Free International to better reflect our international work. The organization is still headquartered in London. I'm out here in California, and I run our US campaigns for the organization. Over here on the picture, we have an event that we did up at the Capitol with my colleague from the science team and a bunch of rescued beagles that had been released from a lab up in Washington, D.C. So that's what's pictured there. Just to kind of give us a starting point, looking at the 2023 numbers of the number of animals used held or used in laboratories. Now, of course, the Animal Welfare Act does not include animals, the majority of animals used in research. So rats, mice, and birds bred for use in research are not counted under the act, as well as fish and amphibians and reptiles. They're not counted. But of the animals counted, here are the 2023 numbers. Over 649,000 animals were used in experiments in 2023, and that included over 42,000 dogs, 65,000 monkeys, and then, of course, with the rabbits, 114,768 rabbits. For held in laboratories, those are animals that weren't used in research, but were held in laboratories. So these might be breeding animals or animals that are surplus at the time to the needs. But 34% of the animals held but not used in laboratories in 2023 were primates. Now, in our first 2 sessions, we had a presentation from the North America Primate Sanctuary Alliance, and I'm sharing one of their slides here that gave a great background on the makeup of primates in sanctuaries. Chimpanzees and apes were at one point exploited in large numbers, but right now they're no longer bred in research or the pet trade, although 12 states still do allow the private ownership of chimpanzees. There is a limited and aging population of apes in captivity, and the Sanctuary Association is leading the process for housing all those apes, and eventually there will be no more chimpanzees, but they are a long-lived species, so there will be a housing need for chimpanzees for quite some time, but the numbers are decreasing. For other primates, that's not the case. They are actively bred for research and in the pet trade, and 23 states allow them to be kept as pets. So there is a growing captive population, and in laboratories as well as in private ownership. So more sanctuary space is needed. The next slide shows an example of where the requests come from. They did a poll of their sanctuaries of requests that they get for placements of primates. And you can see that most of the requests that they receive are from laboratories looking to place their primates that are no longer needed or wanted for research. So, and of course, they can't take in every primate that they're offered. So that's sanctuary space is a huge barrier right now. For an overview of our companion animal session, I just did one slide to quickly go over. We had the Beagle Alliance from Canada gave us a great overview of what their main challenges were. And for dogs and beagles coming out of research, one of the biggest challenges that they found was a lack of laboratories willing to release beagles or to work with rescue groups. They do have a great need for committed foster homes and adopters, those that are willing to work with the dogs when they come out of research. There's some training and rehab that's necessary, but they tend to be able to find lots of foster homes and lots of people willing and interested in adopting the animals that come out of research. Beagles are a popular breed, and many are interested. They just would actually like to have more working relationships with laboratories. With guinea pigs, the opposite is sort of true. We had Gardner's Pig Pen give us some information on guinea pigs released from laboratories. They're rarely released, and there are rescues, but there are very few rescues that specialize in small mammals, and they are dealing with a high number of guinea pigs coming to them from the pet trade. They are limited in the number of homes and adoptive homes that are qualified to care for guinea pigs. And another barrier, they saw that many of the guinea pigs that would be released from laboratory are white with red eyes. And unfortunately, this color combination is really unpopular with the public, so it can be hard or take a long time to find homes for guinea pigs. With rabbits, it was a similar situation, although I'd explain their release more sporadically. So not having laboratories willing to work regularly with rescues mean that sometimes rabbits will become available for release, and rescue groups will coordinate very quickly, trying to find enough foster homes to take in as many of the rabbits as they can that were released. And so one of the other barriers is that oftentimes the animals are not spayed, neutered, or vaccinated, so that's an expense that the rescues then have to take on. And once again, they are also dealing with a high number of rabbits in the pet trade, and there aren't very many sanctuaries or any that are just taking in rabbits from laboratories, although there are some goals to create more sanctuary space. And again, the breeds and colors that are released from laboratories aren't as popular with the public. They tend to be New Zealand rabbits, which are the larger rabbits, and they're usually often white with red eyes, or black rabbits like this rabbit here, who is one of my laboratory rabbits, Moira. And those are the key takeaways. Moving on to laws, there are 16 states so far that have passed laboratory adoption laws. And most of these state laws are broadly similar. All except for one law just recently passed in Virginia apply solely to dogs and cats. Most of them apply to facilities that receive public funds, such as institutes of higher education, although some also include product testing facilities, and in a few instances, all testing facilities in the state. All of them stipulate that animals can be placed privately through the facility's own program, or they can be offered to rescues and shelters. And the definition of a rescue and shelter differs between the states. And most of them include language saying that the animal must be healthy and suitable for adoption, and that is determined by the facility itself or the staff veterinarian. And about half of the states provide research with immunity from civil liability that follows the adoption of any of these animals. There are a few states that have some notable additional stipulations. Nevada, for example, limits the length of time that a dog or cat could be used in research to 2 years before it needs to be considered for adoption. Illinois requires that research facilities post their adoption policies on their website. And Oregon requires that research facilities submit an annual report to the Secretary of State that includes the number of dogs and cats used by the facility and the number released, as well as the names and addresses of the shelters and rescue groups that they were working with. These, what I call accountability measures, are actually really important. We did a survey in 2020 to try to assess the impact of laboratory adoption laws, in particular California. So we surveyed California facilities that were covered by the law that exists in California, and asked about whether or not they had any costs associated with adopting animals, whether the numbers of animals they had used, and whether they had adoption policies in place. And you can see some of them that actually use, some of them didn't use animals during those years, so that's not a problem. But many of them don't even have adoption policies for animals, and many of them did not provide information on the number of animals placed, and they weren't working with rescue groups. And then some facilities didn't respond to our FOIA, or they took a really long time to respond to that. So the public accountability piece is really important. So that leads to this slide, improvements in all the state laws, and some states have had new laws introduced that try to go back and add some of these stipulations, that requiring a facility to develop an adoption policy and make that a policy available on their website is one way to ensure and help hold facilities accountable for adopting out animals that they no longer want, and also maintaining the number of animals used, and to make that information available on a website or a designated agency. And of course, to make the information on the shelters and rescues that are working with the facility, and to make that information publicly available, like the Oregon law. And then of course, expanding to include more animals would be a way to improve state laws. Next, I'm going to talk about the National Institutes of Health, just because the National Institutes of Health provides so much funding, and most of the funding it provides to animal research goes to extramural facilities, so universities and such that do experiments on animals or use animals in the laboratory. So they have a huge potential to have an influence on homing of animals, but they currently don't have any requirements for the homing of laboratory animals that are used with funds from the NIH. A recent report from the NIH that was created in response to a request in the 2023 appropriations package offered some valuable insights into the NIH's stance on research adoption. However, it also highlighted some apparent contradictions. One of the things it mentioned in the report was that they had laws in place that supported the greatest commitment to animal welfare. However, that commitment to animal welfare currently ends when the research protocol is over, since they don't give any recommendations for the placement of animals after research has concluded. And also part of that report, it stipulated that animals were considered supplies that then became the property of the grant recipient, and that there was no requirement, of course, that the animal be considered for adoption. And the report seemed to suggest that it was improper to, if animals are supplies, then to have a set of rules for what needs to happen to those supplies when the research protocol is over. But there are already laws in place that stipulate how animals need to be cared for while they're in the laboratory, and it treats them different than supplies. So there really would be no problem with a precedent to treating animals differently than other supplies. Another problem is that the grant policy statement actually does not allow grant funds to be used to help. Grant money can't be used to prepare the animals for adoption or help place those animals in any way. If they would just change this policy, it would help place a lot more laboratory animals, and would also send a message that that's what's expected. So there could be changes to NIH policy to ensure that researchers are more actively considering replacement of animals used in research. Oh, here's a picture of Congressman Cardenas, and he was the sponsor of the bill that I will talk about in the next. This is an event from Capitol Hill. But there was a bill called the Companion Animal Release from Experiments Act. Congressman Cardenas retired last year, but for 2 sessions, this bill was active. And it would do many of the things that I've talked about. It required all research facilities that receive funding from the NIH to have an adoption policy for dogs, cats, and rabbits no longer wanted for research, required that those adoption policies were publicly available, and required them to maintain records on the release of animals and make that information available on their websites. To move over to chimpanzees, some potential solutions to finding placement for and the problem with lack of laboratory space, we might be able to, or lack of sanctuary space for laboratory primates, look to the path that the chimpanzee took place. The Chimpanzee Health Improvement Act was signed into law by President Clinton in 2000, and it amended the Public Health Services Act to provide a system of sanctuaries for chimps that were no longer needed for research. And it prohibited the destruction of chimpanzees except for health reasons of the chimpanzees or for the considerations of the animal's well-being. So that's the first law that prohibited the killing of a non-human species for the convenience of a laboratory, and it established a federally funded retirement system for chimps. And in 2013, the amendments to the Chimp Act removed the $30 million spending cap that was originally on that amount of money. So pulling from that, an idea for the problem with placements from laboratory primates is that perhaps a similar fund could be established for primates used in laboratory research, especially those that are funded. And this is just some example language that would potentially be useful in a bill to help create more funding and sanctuary space for other primates no longer used in research. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Monica. So let me see if I have the tech savviness to. How does that look? Hopefully you all can see that. If not, I'm sure somebody will tell me. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this topic of rehoming laboratory animals. I've titled this Out of the Lab into a Home. And I'm Rebecca Critser. I use she, her pronouns. Let's see here. Jessica did a great job with my background, so I won't go into that again. But I do just want to acknowledge and thank my co-chair of the Science and Technology Subcommittee, Daria Bednarczyk. She's been doing a fabulous job, and we couldn't do this work without her. So thank you, Daria. And in addition to thanking the Animal Law or the ABA TIPS and the Animal Law Committee leadership as well for their support of this webinar and the work that we're doing here. I do have to just add my obligatory disclaimer. Anything I say here today, they are my own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any institution or organization that I may be affiliated with. Okay, so let's dive in. I am gonna go through sort of three major sections. I'm gonna do a little bit of an intro, try to situate this conversation in current events and talk about what's at stake for these laboratory animals. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about legislative advocacy and not information that's too dissimilar from what Monica discussed. I do want to highlight that I'm specifically and exclusively focusing on legislative advocacy, not because I'm not interested in other forms of legal reform, but when I was preparing for this presentation and I gave some thought to other avenues, I came up short of anything that I felt was concrete enough to bring to this talk today. And so I would be curious, maybe in the Q&A, or if you want to connect offline, if other people have ideas about how to advocate for the rehoming, the relocation, or retirement of lab animals that aren't exclusively legislative efforts. And then finally, I'm going to bring in NAMs into the conversation. So NAMs, non-animal models, or you might hear new approach methodologies. As we talk about relocating animals to homes or sanctuaries, we're going to be butting up against this resource issue on an ongoing basis. And I think the real heart of the matter is we need to be reducing and ultimately replacing and removing animals from a laboratory setting in order to fully sort of account for the animals and their well-being. And I think NAMs is really the only way we can do that. My team spends a lot of time advocating for NAMs, And we really think NAMs are the best way forward, both for the well-being of the animals, but also just for the best science, for the best public health policy. So let's jump in. Oh, yes, I forgot I had included this. This is just a reminder, as Monica and Jessica also gave, that this is sort of contextually the third of three webinars. And a major thank you to the previous panelists, Mallory from Save the Buns, Lori from the Beagle Alliance, Amy from Chimp Haven, and Tim from Oklahoma Primate Sanctuary. And we're really doing our best to sort of respond to the issues that they identified from a legal lens. So what's at stake? Not to put too fine a point on it, but it comes down to a matter of life or death. You may have seen in the news, there's been some development around laboratory animal law. So recently we had the FDA put out a roadmap to reducing animal testing and preclinical safety studies, sort of putting in writing their commitment to reducing animal use and promoting non-animal models in their safety studies, starting with monoclonal antibodies. We've seen Zeldin from the EPA recommit to a previous commitment to reduce animal testing under the EPA. Previously, there was a specified deadline. To my knowledge, that deadline has not been recommitted to, but the general idea of wanting to end animal testing has been recommitted to under the EPA. We've seen NIH prioritize human-based research technologies. In their partnership with the FDA, they're starting a new subdivision called OREVA, looking to promote NAMs and reduce animal testing. We've also seen GAO, or the Government Accountability Office, GAO, put out a recent report on human organ on a chip, which is a type of NAM and a microphysiological system in particular. And perhaps mostly recently, Veterans Affairs has committed to ending medical research on primates. And so, as we see these primates coming out of research, hopefully going to sanctuary, we need to address some of these gaps in that pipeline. Ideally, because we're left with this question, what happens to the animals, right? We're going to end the testing and the studies, hopefully bring in NAMs. So what happens to the animals? When we think about moving animals from a lab to either a rescue or a shelter or a sanctuary, I put together this flow chart because this is how I think about things. And I also just wanted to highlight all of the players involved in this work. So we have the lab itself where you have your PIs, your technicians, as well as your administrative staff. And then when you go to the rescue shelters, we have people there who are taking in animals and getting them prepared for their forever homes. And then we have the familial homes, as I'm going to refer to them, that adopt out the companion animals like cats and dogs and rabbits and others. Now, on a different path are animals like primates that aren't going to go to a rescue shelter or a familial home. They're going to go to a sanctuary, ideally. And so similarly, they start in the lab, but then their pathway is a little bit different. And in particular, I wanted to use this slide to highlight that we also have the people doing the transportation. So you can see the little trucks on the left to right side. And that is a very important step, a very important process. It is very much necessary to properly prepare an animal to be transported, as well as to understand the needs of the animal once they've been transported and how to properly acclimate them to their new setting and their new surroundings. So I just want to keep all of these players in mind when we think about how to best support the rehoming, releasing, retirement system. Okay, so a little bit about legislative advocacy. We're going to do some federal and state discussions. I reviewed the prior two webinars in preparing for today's discussion, and these were my four key takeaways, things that I thought were most highlighted in those 2-hour-long presentations. So the first is that we really need resources to support new and expanded sanctuaries. And I don't necessarily mean exclusively financial resources, but I certainly including financial resources. I think multiple people spoke about the fact that, for example, under primate sanctuaries, in many cases there is land available, but they don't necessarily have the resources to either develop new habitat for incoming primates, or to refit habitats that maybe were previously designed for chimpanzees that they want to switch over to a habitat that's better for a macaque or another monkey. They also need the resources to bring on personnel, for example, veterinarians, to support additional primates in their care. Additionally, we talked about allocation of finances to support transportation and care. And when I talk about care here, I do mean care either at the shelter or the rescue, or care at the sanctuary, sort of post-laboratory care. Um, Tim Ajax talked about how it would be ideal if there was planning at the early stage, sort of per diem or an annual sort of cost associated with the care of the monkeys that came with them and that was earmarked for them at the beginning of their use. As Monica mentioned, mandatory adoption laws are one way forward. Many states, not a majority, but a handful of the states have them. Several others have considered them, but it would be also great to see them at the federal level. And then we'll talk a little bit about reporting requirements and the role of reporting requirements when it comes to the issue of transparency and accountability. So where are we at on these 4 prongs? Well, I'm actually going to go a little bit backwards. I apologize. I'm going to go from the right to the left of my screen. These are 3 bills that were introduced at one point at the federal level. So in 2019, you have the Humane Retirement Act, which is very similar to the Beagle bill that we see at the state level. So the Humane Retirement Act proposed to amend the Public Health Services Act and was limited to just cats and dogs. And I do want to remind everybody that there are 2 main federal laws when it comes to the use of animals in a laboratory setting. Is the Public Health Services Act, which governs public health services policy, and then of course the Animal Welfare Act. So this looked to amend the Public Health Services Act and applied it to cats and dogs only. Then about 4 years later, we have the CARE Act, which Monica mentioned. And I will just highlight that this expanded beyond cats and dogs to include rabbits. And it still was focused on the Public Health Services Act. It included sections like immunity for the researchers, barring sort of willful misconduct, as well as the requirements for publicly facing record information. And then we also have Violet's Law. So Violet's Law has been introduced several times. It has yet to pass. It most recently was introduced this year, this past session, or this current session. And Violet's Law, unlike the other 2, actually looks to amend the Animal Welfare Act and to require federal research facilities to develop a process to release or rehome lab animals. And it has an even more expansive coverage of species. It's dogs, cats, rabbits, but also non-human primates, guinea pigs, and hamsters. Now, we can't talk about laboratory animal law at the federal level in 2025 without talking about the SPARE Act. If you're familiar with the SPARE Act, you're probably most familiar with the section that talks about ending all animal research within, I think, maybe 3+ year timeline. But what I want to focus on is the part of the SPARE Act that actually speaks to adoption of laboratory animals. And it calls for all federally funded facilities to establish adoption programs for laboratory animals. And it has additional reporting requirements to both APHIS, that oversees the Animal Welfare Act, as well as OLAW, who oversees the Public Health Services Policy. And it requires a public database that reports out on the animal disposition. So there is a lot going on there, and I just want to remind you that both the SPARE Act and Violet's Law are currently introduced at the federal level right now. So this is a very similar slide to what we saw with Monica. It's a slightly different color scheme, and I confess I borrowed this from the Animal Legal and Historical Center at Michigan State University, run by David Favor. This highlights the states that have already passed an adoption law requirement. And so I won't spend too much additional time on this, except to say a few important potential provisions when thinking about this type of law are those things like the immunity provision, an explicit statement that there's no obligation for a rescue facility to take in an animal because we don't want that overcrowding issue. A requirement to post your policy on the website, again, that goes to the transparency topic. And then a disposition reporting database management requirement as well are not necessarily in each of these laws in these states, but are in some of them and are potentially a good idea sort of for best practices, and you're developing a model or a standard law. Now, I think Monica highlighted for us that Illinois has a requirement to post adoption policies. It is only for cats and dogs because Illinois' law only applies for cats and dogs. It would be great to see it expanded to additional animals, and it would be great to see other states require this as well because it really gets back to that transparency issue and having the general public understand sort of what the policy is and how these facilities are handling the adoption of the animals. Monica mentioned that there is one state that requires adoption of more than just cats and dogs, and that is Virginia. Just this year, Virginia passed their law that requires adoption for non-human primates. Now, this is a really exciting time. It would be great if other states followed suit and expanded the species that adoption was required for. I did want to highlight one aspect of the law that I think was interesting and is something worth considering when you're working in this space, which is especially for primates, when you're relocating them, where are they permitted to go? And when we say sanctuary, what does sanctuary mean? Now, our previous speakers did a great job of outlining the role of GFAS, I think a Global Federation for Animal Sanctuaries, and we had a speaker from NAPSA who helps facilitate communication amongst the different sanctuaries. The Virginia law, in addition to defining sanctuary as a GFAS accredited sanctuary, also includes facilities that are AZA accredited. And as we know, AZA is the accrediting body for many zoos and aquariums. And one of the key differences between sanctuaries and even AZA accredited zoos is the requirements around allowing people to come to interact with the animals. I think under GFAS accreditation, guests cannot tour a facility unless it's a guided tour. And so there is a shift in sort of the emphasis under a GFAS accrediting system to explicitly and maybe perhaps just exclusively the well-being of the animal. Now, having said all of this, AZA accredited zoos do a very good job of maintaining the welfare of their animals. I just had the good fortune of visiting with the AZA accredited zoo with some of my students, and I was very struck by, and I knew this intellectually, but I was very struck by how much the people who work there really do care about the animals and their knowledge of the animals on an individual basis. And certainly allowing animals to go to an AZA accredited facility would help with the numbers issue, right? In terms of space issues and allocations. So that's just a tension, something to think about, whether you think primates should be relocated exclusively to a GFAS accredited sanctuary, or whether perhaps AZA accredited zoos should be brought under that umbrella. Okay, so this is sort of my recap of my key takeaways for what we need and what people who are in the legal arena can do to help. We really need federal investment in sanctuary infrastructure. And I've been thinking about how there's the saying about you shouldn't throw money at the problem or just throw money at the problem. And certainly we can't just throw money at this problem, but we definitely need to throw some money at this problem. And ideally, as animal use is being reduced, some of those funds can be used to support their retirement and their rehoming. We do need, I think, more thoughtful and pre-planned sort of thinking about the retirement of these animals. And that should really ideally be at the grant acquisition phase. Monica mentioned how NIH grants money can't currently be used for the adoption of lab animals. And it would be great to see that changed because I think if that did change, it could also help change the narrative and help this process begin at a very much earlier phase where you could start to plan for transportation earlier, you could start to plan for their financial care earlier. We also need to kind of have a requirement for the consideration of adoption. That's the mandatory adoption laws. And I do want to make clear, mandatory adoption laws do not mandate adoption. They mandate the consideration of adoption. And so there are situations where the animal is not well enough to be adopted out. It's not in the animal's best interest to be adopted out. or potentially cases, depending on the research protocol, where it's not safe. It's a public health, public safety issue to consider. We need to improve transparency through reporting. And the two main ones you've heard us talk about several times now, reporting adoption policies on websites, and then accounting for animal disposition, either through, I would suggest either a state-run database or again on the website. And then finally, we need to onboard NAMs. And so this transitions me to my next and my final point, because I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions, is the role of NAMs. We've had a 3Rs for a long time now, and it's time to get serious about reducing animals in the laboratory setting and ultimately replacing them. And I think in order to do that effectively, we need these new approach methodologies. So I could talk a lot about NAMs. I'm just going to make 2 points, and let's see if I can do this. Oh, it does show up. Okay, so right now you have something like what you see on the slide on the left-hand side, where the cat sort of knows where to start and knows where they're supposed to end up, but is confused about exactly how to get from A to B. So what we really need is this chalk line here to clearly extend and tell us, okay, go straight, go left, go up, go right, all the way till it gets over here. And we need there to not be that ambiguity and that lack of clarity. And that's something that the FDA roadmap actually calls out in their policy section. I think it's currently a known issue. It's just an issue that we need to move forward and actually make progress on resolving. And to be honest, an issue our team spends a fair amount of time thinking about. Again, I don't always want to just say we need to throw money at the problem, but we do need financial investment. And this is not just financial investment in the development of new NAMs, new technology, but it's also financial investment in regulatory oversight, training regulatory personnel to onboard NAMs, to approve NAMs, as well as providing resources for PIs and research facilities that are interested in transitioning from animal models to new approach methodologies. So these are the two I'm highlighting for you. There's a lot we could talk about, but if we're serious about rehoming animals and we know there's a resource problem, it's also important that we look to what alternatives there are for animals in the research and testing arena. And I think with that, I will conclude and turn it back over to Jessica.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Monica. These presentations were great. As I mentioned, if anyone in the audience has questions, you can put them in the chat. And then we have a question that we can start off with for you both. For animals that are eligible to be homed after having lived in a laboratory, are there any limitations to homing those animals? Or for instance, are there any specific species that have legal restrictions or like specific restrictions around being released to private owners or sanctuaries? I know you guys touched a little bit on that, but hoping you guys could deep dive specifically for the animals that, like, for all other reasons would be easy to get to a home.
I'll try to answer that. So initially, the laboratory decides whether an animal is releasable or not. Often, I imagine they work with their veterinarian about health and temperament, and then release the animal. And then it becomes the job of the rescue organization to decide when that animal is ready for adoption, or whether or not they have an adopter who's a good fit. And the animal, we're usually talking about, dogs, cats, and rabbits. But other animals. And then when it comes to primates, we don't advocate putting those primates in private homes, even though some states allow private ownership of primates. It's just it's never a good fit to put a primate in a private home. So, and then many states don't allow, but I think most of the companion animals used in research are allowed as companion animals in any state. Ferrets being an exception. So that would be one animal that's considered a companion animal in some states and not others. But otherwise, there wouldn't, I can see, be any restrictions except when it comes to the exotics or wild animals like primates.
And I don't have a lot to add. I apologize on the companion animal on a state-by-state law basis, but I will just reiterate that, there are limitations if there are public health or safety concerns. And then one thing I did want to highlight is there's a narrative, particularly, I would say, coming out of the research side, that sometimes there are animals who how do I best put this? For whatever reason, they've lived in captivity so long that they wouldn't do well in a sanctuary, for example. They wouldn't do well in a familial home. And um, I think particularly when we're talking about sanctuaries where there are professionals caring for these animals, I personally don't find that to be a robust argument. I think it's more about being able to adjust for the individual animal and accommodate the additional potentially transportation needs, additionally potential on-site sort of gradual introduction to the new facility or the new place. So there are those considerations.
Thank you both. We do have a few questions from the audience. The first one is from Joan. Joan explains that rehomed lab cats and dogs have special days to acclimate to family life and possible particular medical needs. Is there a way in federal law to provide funds to rescues which might provide training to adoptive companion animal parents for behavior and health issues?
Certainly any law could be written in that would require laboratories to provide that funding. There currently isn't, but that one of the ideas we talked about is the NIH at least allowing grant money to be used for that purpose could be really helpful. Even if they just, with the spay and neuter, or, it's a huge expense for a rescue to take on, if some of that grant money could be used to plan for the release of animals would be one step. And so there were some bills like the CARE Act that sought to do that. And then, but we actually don't need legislation for the NIH to change its grant policy. They could do that at any time, and they could also provide guidance at any time that they want to. So we can continue to push for that outside of legislative angle.
Yeah, so I echo all of that, and the fact that we could write a law pretty much to say anything. I think the question often comes down to where's the funding going to come from, and because I don't seem to be able to get away from ever talking about this bill, I'm going to bring up this Maryland law that was just enacted last year, and it's not a one-to-one translation, but I think it sets out a really good sort of platform or model to follow. So this Maryland law actually assesses a fee against research facilities that use animals in testing, and the funds from that fee goes into a fund pool that is used to provide money for the development of NAMs. Now, you could set up something similar, and instead of using it for the development of NAMs, perhaps you use it for providing for the care of the animals after the laboratory life, or training for people who want to take on animals who have higher medical needs. So I'm really interested in the Maryland law and following it and seeing how it goes. And I think it could be a really interesting model to be used in a variety of different ways.
Thank you. Conley has the next question. He asks if, for regarding transportation beyond resource allocation and mandated facility adoption plans, would it be possible or desirable to amend the AWA to incorporate transport-specific care requirements, and maybe regulations similar to existing species-specific requirements, but ones pertaining to, for example, primate transport needs? Is there anything already contemplated in Violet's law?
So under the Animal Welfare Act, there is already some regulations about transporting animals, so those could certainly apply. I don't know that Violet's law has any information, but Violet's law only applies to intramural research. So, but there still would be some transport involved, as well as the Humane Retirement Act also only applied to intramural research so a small subset of the research, whereas the CARE Act applied to any facility that received NIH funding would be impacted. But I think existing Animal Welfare Act requirements would cover things like primates and the transport of dogs and cats and other animals.
I will just say I'm always a little weary to amend the Animal Welfare Act, but certainly could be done. Certainly could be done.
Maybe doing regulations as the amendment for the AWA instead of the actual act could be helpful. Thank you. Our next question is from Parsva, and Parsva is a law student and asked about how students can get involved, and especially as an incoming law school student.
I love that question. I'm so excited to hear from you. Of course, I'm a little biased. I think probably we're all a little biased on this panel right now, but I would have to say one of the great ways is to join the ABA Animal Law Committee. There are many subcommittees at the Animal Law Committee, but I would highly recommend the Science and Technology Subcommittee. We're a fairly active group. We meet once a month, and we have a lot more webinars and other events in the hopper. And so we'd love to have you or any law student interested join us and help us develop that curriculum. Uh, I will say is also oftentimes a good idea to check with your state bar associations. They often have animal law committees that can be active on different levels, and they're often looking actually for a student liaison. Of course, you should check your school to see if they have a SALDIF chapter, or whatever they're called now, the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, at many schools. It was certainly instrumental to my being at a law school and getting into animal law. And if they don't have one, there are some great people you can reach out to at ALDF to start one.
Yeah, I will echo that. The animal law program at ALDF is solely dedicated to education regarding animal everything causes within law. And so if you want to check out the website, aldf.org, you can navigate to the student chapters and reach out, and my colleagues in that program will be happy to help. So, and then Isaiah actually echoed a question, but do you have any recommendations for people who are pre-law? So they're still an undergrad that might be different from what you just recommended.
Yeah, I mean, so if you're pre-law and you already know that you're interested maybe in animal law or maybe in animals and research in particular, I would say the best way is to make connections, reach out to folks. We're always very happy to connect with students at all levels. In the toxicology policy program, we're very active on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Blue Sky. We also have a blog. You can go to our website and read some of the topics we've been engaging with most recently. But also the Animal Law Conference in the US is coming up in Chicago in October, I believe. And it's a great way to meet people in person. They do have a virtual component, I think. So if you're not able to attend in person, you can do it online. And there are other animal law conferences. There's one in Canada and over in the UK and in Europe. And so I think the best thing to do at this point is if you can connect with people and then just read and learn as much as possible.
Thank you. Joanna has the next question and asks, starts off with context that you mentioned that most of the guinea pigs and rabbits available for rehoming tend to be less desirable in color, specifically white with red eyes. Are those animals selected for testing because they're more compatible with research protocols, or are they simply the ones left over after testing is completed?
It just happens to be the breed of rabbit that's long been used for laboratory research. It's sort of the standard. And the New Zealand rabbit, from the same litter, can have a black rabbits like the one in the picture or a red with white eyes, and same with the guinea pigs and other ones. It's just kind of the standard laboratory animal is that breed. Although there have been some released from laboratories that are a Dutch rabbit, which are those half black and white rabbits. Those are sometimes used in antibodies research and other things, and they have been released from labs, so it's a little bit different than the New Zealand.
Our next question is from Kazia, and Kazia explains that they're a foster home for released lab mice. Is there anything that they can do as a citizen to help support the advancement of legal protections for those little guys?
I don't have a great answer. I think my textbook answer is as much as you can be active with the legislatures and voice your passion for these little guys, that actually really goes a long way. So both at the state level and federal level, almost every year, and this year is the opposite of an exception. This year there are even more bills than normal. But almost every year there's some bill that you could reach out to and talk to them about and support. Also, in many states, oh, Humane World, I'm forgetting their new name.
Humane World International is the one. Yeah, Animal
Former
Humane World.
HSUS.
Apologies,
Um,
everyone to HSUS.
apologies. But they, in many of the states, they do lobby days. And so you can get involved and you can go to the state lobby or the state capitol and do a little bit of lobbying, and they kind of walk you through the process, which is really nice if it's not a process you are familiar with. It really should be an activity that's accessible to everyone. And you don't have to go in person. You can call your representative. Just the other day, actually, I was calling about Massachusetts because that's where I'm located, bill having to do with primates and research. And actually, the representative called me back on the phone, which was very nice. So that would be my key recommendation, is to get as involved in sort of the lobbying effort as you can as a citizen, as an individual.
I mean, you don't have to be an organization to do that, which is pretty cool, very empowering. Jess has the next question and asks, are mice and rats included in any of the pending bills considering their exclusion from the Animal Welfare Act?
So they aren't, although maybe, not sure if Violet's law does, but a Public Health Services Act does cover that. So like an NIH research does cover mice and rats, but they aren't included in legislation. And I think that's just partly an optics thing. If we can't get, requirements for adoption of dogs and cats that legislators are familiar with and that have lots of people interested in adopting, then expanding to the other animals we would hope would follow. But one area of potential hope, when I did review the adoption policies of the few universities that sent them to me or that had them posted on their website, most of those adoption policies applied to all animals. Now, whether they actively followed through for placement for those other animals is another story. But once I think there becomes a culture accepting of more accepted to placing animals, and they can see that they can successfully adopt out animals to groups and find homes for them, then it might become more common.
Thanks. And just quickly, Joan put in the new website for Humane World for Animals, and it's humaneworld.org. Thank you, Joan. We really appreciate it. And again, apologies for still adjusting to the new name. Some people have just dealt with the former name for decades. So thanks for being flexible with that and compassionate. This is a comment from James, and perhaps you guys have response comments to it, but the Animal Welfare Act regulations should be amended to require transport plans for all species of animals, at least when those animals have special needs. Currently, transport plans are only required for marine mammals. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, that would be great. And there are requirements for the transport of animals depending on where they're going. So if you're transporting animals across state lines, there is requirements for the transport of dogs and cats and the animals that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act, some basic requirements, and birds now have requirements too for the ones that are covered.
Yeah, and I nothing. I would be for that. I'm certainly not against it. I also just want to highlight, especially, I mean, any area of law, any area of animal law, especially transportation. It seems like enforcement is a big issue. So, in addition to expanding sort of the scope of the requirements, we always need to think about how to make sure and the enforcement piece also happens.
Yeah, it's a huge issue for animals in every industry. The 28-hour law is a perfect example of not being effective or enforced. Laura has our last question. If the laws discussed expressly cover dogs, cats, rabbits, and NHPs, non-human primates, are there protections beyond the Animal Welfare Act for other types of animals, or are those animals excluded, for instance, pigs, goats, etc., in any way? Are there metrics for all the animals beyond dogs, cats, rabbits, non-human primates who are excluded from research? And I think there is, like, for instance, a horse or a cow, like if they're used for research purposes, they would be included because they're a mammal, but like for the AWA would exclude them because if they're used for the industrial animal agriculture industry. So it also depends on the class of species. Dogs and pet stores have a similar situation like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I fully wrapped my head around the question, so I apologize. But I will say a few things. One, Jessica is correct. So for those of you who are not intimately familiar with the Animal Welfare Act, as some of us are, its exclusions come from how it defines the word animal, um, which drives me, as someone with a science background, a little bit batty. But so it excludes certain animals. So it's warm-blooded to start. Um, and then it excludes mice, rats, and birds bred for research purposes. And then it excludes animals, essentially farmed animals. But certainly if they're being used for research, even under, for example, the Agricultural Research Services, which is a subdivision of the USDA, their primary purpose is to do research on farmed animals, and they are covered under that definition. Now, of course, we also have the Public Health Services Act, which is a totally separate federal law from the Animal Welfare Act, and it draws the line. Well, it defines animal as being a vertebrate. And there's no carve out for mice and rats. So mice and rats and birds are all vertebrates, so they're all in that bucket. It does limit its scope based upon whether or not you receive specifically public health funds, which the NIH and most of the funds we're talking about here are those funds. So I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully that provides some scope of the federal laws and in terms of the species and use coverage.
And I didn't understand the last positioning, the positioning of the last question, but Laura had said, are there metrics for all the animals beyond dogs, cats, rabbits, non-human primates who are exited from research? And that was the part I didn't understand. I guess what they mean is like, and Laura, please correct me if I'm wrong, homed or rehomed after laboratory use.
Yeah. Well, there's no metrics for any. There's no official reporting of the animals that are released for adoption. But as far as the counting of the number of animals used in research, they do count those, what we would consider farmed animals and horses. They count those animals used in research. So those numbers are available, but none of the numbers, they don't release numbers on those that are released for homing for any of animals officially.
Yeah, most of our numbers come from federal reporting requirements to the USDA. So that's going to be explicitly and exclusively under the Animal Welfare Act. There is no numbers reporting requirement under the Public Health Services Act, which is where you get the mice and the rats and the birds that do have coverage.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any numbers for euthanized animals or metrics for those?
I don't remember whether the forms include how many animals you euthanized that year. You do have how many animals were used, how many animals were used in painful procedures. I think how many animals bred. But I'd have to go back and check. I apologize. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Well, that is at the conclusion too of our webinar, so perfect timing. Thank you both again for presenting, and we would also like to thank the ABA's tip section again. This webinar is being hosted by the TIPS Animal Law Committee and the ALC's Science and Technology Subcommittee. So if you are an ABA member and you'd like to get involved, please reach out to Rebecca, and we would love to have you join.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.